Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I am Yuyun Zhan, host of our monthly podcast, Zhonghua Mundus, that brings you recent updates about China's economy. As usual, I am with our senior fellow, Alicia Garcia Herrero. Hi, Alicia. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
We're also glad to have with us today Jianwei Xu, non-resident fellow from Bruegel. Hello, Jianwei. Welcome to The Sound of Economics.
Hello, Yujun.
Since the bursting of China's real estate bubble in mid-2021, there has been a growing concern that the Chinese economy could end up like that of Japan in the early 1990s. Alicia and Jianwei have been working on a paper on whether China's economy will follow the same path as Japan's. Alicia, could you give us a summary of the similarities between these two economies?
So firstly, this is a policy brief that Jianwei and I will be publishing today for Bruegel. So best thing our listeners can do is to read, if possible, that piece and see there, what kind of similarities we have found. I mean, this is a big topic. There's a lot written about it. But Jianwei and I have taken the core similarity between Japan and China, which is its basically excess savings, if you want, macroeconomic imbalance as the starter. This similarity explains developments in first Japan, obviously, then China's industrial policy scheme of things, like becoming a major exporter, because in a way, if you have excess savings, you're bound to have a current account surplus because you have excess savings. You don't have enough investment for all of your savings. So, that kind of structural similarity is the core of the paper. There are obvious similarities beyond that, which we refer to, which is like kind of the trigger similarity, which is the real estate collapse, the bubble collapsed. It's not that it is the same, and we explain differences as well. So, the case of Japan starts with bubble that is kind of pushed by the appreciation of the yen after the Plaza Accord. We don't have all of that in China. In a way, interestingly, in China, the bubble kind of bursts before Japan's bubbles burst historically, meaning in terms of income per capita, in terms of pressure from the US, and so on and so forth. But the developments after the bubble burst are similar, like deflationary pressures. And very importantly, doubling down on the same economic model, meaning more industrial policy. In China, we call new production forces, more industrialization, more innovation. Japan did all of that. And this is why we want to compare Japan and China, because those kind of core similarities can, to our mind, help China draw some lessons about, what is maybe too much of a good thing. The idea is too much of a good thing. I mean, that industrialization is good, manufacturing is good, having a current account surplus is good. But when is it too much of a good thing? And Japan offers that lesson. So that is why we wrote this paper.
Thank you, Alicia, for the initial introduction. Yes, the paper will be coming out soon, and all our listeners can read about it on Bruegel website, and we will also put a link in the show notes. Jianwei, as Alicia just mentioned, your paper has highlighted several economic parallels between Japan's lost decade and China today. Well, the real estate bubble, high savings rates, as Alicia has mentioned. Which of these similarities do you think is the most concerning for China?
I fully agree with what Alicia has said, that the slowdown of the China's growth pattern resembles that of Japan in many, many dimensions. Especially, both countries have seen their investment falling very rapidly comparing to the golden era of growth. And real estate, of course, is a highlight of the slump of the investment. The key reason is also because that the previous high-speed growth in China and Japan was so featured in the real estate market that any reversal in the real estate market could contribute massively to the slowdown of the economy. But if you want to ask me which is the most important factor that has played a role here, I would say that is because the savings are not falling as fast as investment. That's the key. Because usually, if the country does not invest that much, people will also have no need to save that much. So, in other words, saving moves aligning with the pattern of investment. However, for both China and Japan, while we have seen, okay, the investment is falling, but people keep on saving. Keep on saving. Okay, we have to admit that saving may be slightly better, slightly also lower than before, but compared to investment, it's still too much. So people continue to save. This actually links to another problem of both economies. That is, both countries are still in the state of investment-driven economy. So people do not consume that much. So while both countries have seen that investment is not, helping the economy as much as before, but another driving force of the economic momentum, namely the consumption part, has also not been rising. So both countries, in my opinion, are now facing a very serious problem: how to boost consumption. And this is particularly, of course, we know that Japan has been battling with this problem for quite a long time. And last decade, they still have not found a very, very robust solution to this problem. But in China, okay, it seems that the Chinese economy is also in the same kind of trap, that it has not successfully transitioned from an investment-driven economy to a consumption-driven economy. That, I would say, is the key for the similarity.
Thank you, Jianwei. Alicia, why do you think that China has, or also Japan has struggled to transition from an investment-based economy to consumption-based? Why are the savings rates so high in both countries?
Yeah. To add to Jianwei's kind of core concern, I have to say, and this is in the paper, China's core concern should be bigger, because actually the excess savings compared to Japan is even bigger, which in a way is astounding, because China's income per capita is lower than that of Japan at that time. So, you would imagine that, but in a way, what I'm trying to say is China is an outlier of the outliers. And now the question is why? Yeah, why even more than Japan, if you want? I think that part, more than Japan, can be explained by a more limited public and private safety net, meaning, or if you want, insurance schemes. So you can think of, pensions, you can think of, healthcare on the public side. But on the private side, all of the life insurance, are most importantly non-life, whether it's private medical or private pension, that is even less developed in China than it was in Japan at the time. So people have to, in a way, resort to precautionary savings to kind of prepare for the future. I would say that the other reason is probably the level of uncertainty. If you think about it, the 80s was, still the era of globalization. China was about to enter the WTO. It was a different and more like safe, if you want, global environment than it is today, especially for China. If you think about U.S. containment. So in that regard, I think that also explains why people feel they need to save. So for all of these reasons, I think, and finally, and very importantly, Japan slowly but steadily opened its capital account, but China has still a rather closed capital account. So the savings are trapped in a way. And that is another reason why you have this excess savings. So all of these reasons for China.
And you also have mentioned in your previous answers that both economies have resorted to industrial policy in order to boost up the economic growth. Jianwei, I want to bring your inputs here. China has also invested heavily in research and development and technology and all sorts. Could this be a factor that will allow it to avoid kind of Japan's prolonged stagnation?
This is a very good question. I think for the case of China, the global context has been much tougher than that has faced about Japan during the last decade. Because during Japan's the so-called last decade, the global environment was much harmonious. Because it still can reach the agreement with the U.S. and also its companies can step outside of its country to invest massively in the U.S., in Europe, globally. So this is a way for Japan to find external opportunities outside of its domestic domain. However, when China is now making the same efforts of a transition, it is trapped by the geopolitical conflict with the U.S. And also we have seen that the China's economic conflict with the European Union regarding the electric vehicles, and also many other concerns, geopolitical concerns. This is actually not only between China and the developed countries. We have also seen that this is happening between China and also the other developing countries. So I would say the geopolitical environment challenging China's economy has been much tougher. That's also why China has a more urgent need to ensure self-sufficiency, especially as regards the technology-wise, because apparently the U.S. is restricting China's access to the most advanced technology, for example, the semiconductor sector. So for China, I think there's a realistic need to boost industrial policy to make the transition. This is not only an economic efficiency problem, but also a security problem for Chinese economy. However, as you said, there's a balance because every economy needs to ensure economic efficiency. So as we said before, one investment cannot boost the economy as fast as before. China needs to transition to the consumption-based economy, but at the same time, it's actually very difficult for China that the country is also facing the geopolitical environment, which makes it more urgent to grasp most advanced technology, which needs industrial policy. So those two factors are actually not always consistent. So this is really a tough time for China. So in my humble opinion, I think China, due to security reasons, it will have to continue industrial policy, as we have seen in the case of DeepSeek, that China is already making some success in the field. But at the same time, it also needs to ensure consumption to sustain its economic growth. So for the prospect of the Chinese economy, how to balance the two aspects, the two factors, will be key for us observers to see how China is going to evolve in the next few years.
Thank you. I think you really touched upon the core issue here, is that the geopolitical turbulence. In the past, the globalization trend where all the economies can just, grow together, and that environment has changed a lot, to say the least. Alicia, would you like to add on here?
Well, so basically what Jian Wei is saying is China needs to consume more, but it's also a good idea to become more self-reliant because of U.S. containment. And this is exactly, this is absolutely fine. But the question really is whether you can do both things at the same time. That's the key question. And I don't have an answer, but I just want to help our readers, or our listeners in this case, understand why this is difficult. Yeah. So when you try to become, technologically independent, and this is actually quite important for Europe because this is what we're discussing at the moment. Yeah. You need to basically invest massively in leapfrogging, existing technologies, and kind of move beyond and reach the frontier there where it's most necessary. And this could be basic technologies or, emerging technologies, etc. These are massive investments. And because basically it's either consumption or investment in a way. I mean, this is basic knowledge of economics. You have a trade-off here. Yeah, if you really want to become, again, first in class for whatever technology, you also need to give up on something. Yeah, this is expenditure in R&D, you name it. And I think this is kind of where it's hard to find the balance in China. I think China is tilted towards a self-reliance, and I understand why. But at the same time, I think this hurts its ultimate, for me, most important objective, which is to balance its economy. Because balancing its economy, and this is quite important actually, sometimes I feel that it seems giving up or giving in to the US pressure of, more consumption and so on. But I think what Jiang Wei and I are saying in our papers that it's actually good for China. It's extremely good for China. So, we need to read it as a plus for China to reduce these imbalances. And I think when you see it that way, you see the trade-off between massive investment, sometimes, frankly, not always successful. Yeah, I mean, China is very successful in certain technologies, but it's also true that there may be a lot of waste, yeah, in trying to achieve frontier kind of level of technology for every technology. So the question is, could China do this in a way that is smart by still fostering consumption, maybe picking the key technologies that are needed and avoiding maybe others, leaving more space for, there's nothing wrong with importing stuff that maybe is not essential for self-reliance, and thereby also fostering more balanced trade, because I think that would help China. It's not only about US strategic competition. We're talking about many countries, yeah, Mexico, Turkey, you name it, India, with big imbalances with China. If China were to import more from these countries, and again, in light of more consumption, that might help China rather than the other way around. So, I think this is a way to kind of put those two things together. Japan eventually reduced its current account surplus massively, but it didn't do that only with the US. It just didn't manage to keep competitive in many sectors. I think China is trying to avoid that. Yeah, trying to avoid that situation. But the unintended consequence is that by keeping your competitiveness to such a high level that Japan never reached the level of exports, to total exports, so market share of global exports that China has achieved today. By doing that so massively, many others, not only the hegemon, not only the US, come after you, and then you create more trouble than solutions. So this is, I think, the kind of the trade-off here between the two things that Jiang Wei said, the technological self-reliance and consumption.
You also mentioned that since China has a bigger global influence, like particularly in the global south, Jiang Wei, how do you think that will also change China's economic trajectory, its relations with other economies in the world?
First of all, I think that China has been expanding the strategy to collaborate with global south for, actually, it's not recent. It's not a recent phenomenon. It has been that for a long time. But we are economists, so we read data from the economic perspective. So if in terms of the trade and investment collaboration in economic theory, there's a very important model, which is called a gravity model. Then, in other words, the two countries which have the largest economic size needs to collaborate more. This is the very important economic rule that economists have observed over using our historical data. So, in other words, although global south is very important for China to pick strategic objectives, but in terms of economic size, the world still has a heavy weight. The world economy has a heavy weight on the US economy, on the European economy, in the developed world, which means that if China wants to sustain its economic growth, especially in the current globalized world, although it's less globalized than before, but it's still much, much better than the completely closed economy. So in order to exploit benefits from this globalized world, China needs to collaborate more with the developed countries, especially the US and also Europe. This is a key. So I think this shapes the fundamental discussion of our prediction. However, China still needs to collaborate with global South, but I think this is more relevant in some specific field. For example, in the developing countries, there are very key key resources, which is important for China's manufacturing capacity. So China needs to keep its strength or its connection to get access to those resources. This is the one thing for key. And of course, in the future, people may say in the future that those markets would grow very, very big and it can be a potential market for China to get in there. But frankly speaking, the existing or the current benefit from those market is still small, much smaller than that comparing to the developed world. So I think for China, so there are two things people need to distinguish. One is if you talk about a strategy that is for the future or long-term strategy, of course, the global South is very important for China to collaborate with. However, if we are facing the current economic reality, the developed country, especially Europe and US, is the key for China to collaborate with.
Thank you very much. Alicia, how do you think the EU will be affected by China's economic trajectory?
So, I mean, what we are saying in our paper is that China's structural deceleration, in a way, is unavoidable, even with a lot of self-reliance and very successful innovation policy. China is bound to grow less over time. The question is how much less. But this again will depend on the success of this innovation policy and the global environment, etc. But I guess what needs to be recognized in Europe is that thinking of China as a growth market might not be the way forward. That doesn't mean China won't be important for our companies. It will be extremely important, but as a mature market. Yeah. So other opportunities in Japan or the US, well, there are, but these are mature markets where competition is intense, where, you basically need to fight your way in because it's about market share. It's not about easy growth opportunities. So I think this is one very important lesson for Europe. The second is that the deflationary pressures, and Jianwei has been working a lot on this, are not temporary. Why? Because China is still in that kind of fight of producing more than it can consume unless policies change. But basically, Japan shows how difficult it is to change those consumption patterns. So without major changes, we will see deflationary pressures coming from China, huge competition globally, not only in China, globally. So this is an environment that European companies need to fully understand, because Europe is basically a major, it's been for many, many years, as a region, basically the largest exporting engine in the world, more than China. People don't realize this when you put all of those countries together and you look at, the last, 40 years or so. So, so for us, it's essential to become more competitive, because China will continue to fight for market share globally, given that it has to put those products somewhere. Yeah. And therefore, in a way, the lesson is, okay, if Japan struggled to find its market share globally after the bubble burst, maybe in some cases successfully, in many unsuccessfully, well, China is going to do that in a much bigger way, maybe even more successfully, because, it's still thriving in technologically. So the shock for Europe is even bigger than Japan ever was. And I think that's the second key lesson.
Thank you very much, Alicia and Jianwei, for joining me for this interesting conversation. For listeners, you can find all our research on China at Bruegel.org and sign up for Zhonghua Mundus, our monthly China podcast and newsletter with link in the show notes. Until next time, bye bye.